But my philosophy is very simple. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble.
Strength and solidarity. The strength and solidarity. Divided is our nation, combating and fighting hatred. The mission, should you choose to accept it, is fighting racist. Psychology is just a space where we run in our simulations. We load you up with the tools, then we plug you into the matrix. So have a seat on the couch, now tell me your situation. Take a look in the mirror, be honest, just who you facing. Marginalized as a youth, what challenges were you faced with? Feeling you wasn't equal, told that you wouldn't make it. Your ID isn't real, got you constantly trying to fake it. Hiding behind masks in the closet till you can't take it. Getting harder to breathe, someone choking you on the pavement. Unspeakable violence attacking you cause you Asian. Accomplices, we accomplish through collaboration. Engaging, educating, evaluating one another. Liberating the future of all our sisters and brothers. Empowering, elevating all communities of color. Strength and solidarity. The strength and solidarity.
The Strength and Solidarity podcast is a conversational piece that invites scholars, community activists, leaders, artists, and entrepreneurs to discuss their work as accomplices in cultivating cross-racial ethnic solidarity. Hosted and produced by Pooja Mamidana and Dr. Donna Deminari, our podcast team also includes our podcast interns, Alexis Rios and Petra Zadroga. The Strength and Solidarity podcast strives to engage, educate, evaluate, and empower communities of color, one episode at a time. Our guest today features Thomas A. Parham, Ph.D. Dr. Parham is the 11th president of California State University, Dominguez Hills, CSUDH. A highly diverse metropolitan university primarily serving the South Central and South Bay areas of Los Angeles County. CSUDH is one of the 23 campuses in the CSU system, the largest system of public higher education in the nation. Dr. Parham previously served as Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs and an adjunct faculty member at the University of California, Irvine, where he had been since 1985. For the past 40-plus years, Dr. Parham has focused his research efforts in the area of psychological negressence and has authored and co-authored 6 books and 45 to 50 journal articles and book chapters. He has sustained a scholarly focus in the areas of racial identity development, African psychology, and multicultural counseling. Dr. Parham grew up in Southern California and received his bachelor's degree in social ecology from the University of California, Irvine, his master's degree in counseling psychology at Washington University in St. Louis, and received his Ph.D. in counseling psychology at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale. Dr. Parham remains an active member of the community, contributing his talents in the areas of social advocacy, community uplift, and youth empowerment. Hi, Dr. Parham. So nice to have you here on our podcast today with Dr. Donna and I, Strength and Solidarity. Thank you so much for being here with us.
Good day. It's a pleasure to be with you, and I'm honored to be asked to participate.
Yes, thank you. So we'd like to begin if you could tell us your journey in your chosen career path.
My journey in my chosen career. Wow. Let's see, where would I start? So my journey, I think, starts with a career change. When I first went to college, growing up in Los Angeles, California, being a socially justice-minded kind of young person. In fact, I think I wrote my first essay about Dr. King in, 7th or 8th grade or something in school. But I grew up amid the marvelous militancy of the 60s and a lot of social consciousness there. In LA, I've been up against the wall by LAPD and, just for walking while black kind of stuff. But my mother once told me, she said, son, you have no business criticizing anything unless you're willing to put something better in its place. So I thought that I could put something better in this place. So I reasoned that my career aspiration was to go into the law or law enforcement. So I thought about being either a police officer or an attorney. I figured the best way, there are two choices. I think that I can articulate it now as a mature black man, but even as a kid, I think I had this awareness that you can either decide to integrate in the system a la a king, or think about being more culturally nationalist and overthrowing the system, unlike some of our, revolutionary folk, or Malcolm or someone else. I chose the former rather than the latter. And so decided that I would see about getting into the law enforcement community, or maybe even being a criminal defense attorney. As I went to college, it turns out that I got kind of turned off with that because I went in as an aspiration career-wise to try to help folk and to make a difference social justice-wise. But it was pretty clear working in the criminal justice system that it required more ability to manipulate the system than it did really to help anybody. And some of the professors I ran into at the college and university I was at then were just kind of redneck and kind of racist folk that were pretty clear about their racism. So, those are the kind of experiences that just turned me off. So I ultimately ended up transferring from that university to the University of California, Irvine, where I met my first mentor, who was the great Joe White. Prior to that transfer, I had a chance to work what your generation now calls service learning. I worked in a program called Educational Participation in the Community, is my memory. And one semester, I worked in a halfway house for so-called incorrigible and runaway youth. And in the second semester, I worked in the community psychology clinic in downtown Long Beach. And that experience, I think, really helped change the trajectory of my life. Because part of deciding what you want to do ultimately is not necessarily what you're interested in, but also what are you good at? And so as I had parents talking to me about, wow, my child is doing much better since they've been working with you at this halfway house, or I have supervisors at the community psych clinic who say, you got a real knack for this. You ought to think about doing this one day. It kind of excited me about that whole career in psychology, where at that point, the most I'd done in psychology, I think, were one or two courses. I think one was in intro to psych. The other, I think, was personality theory. But when I transferred to Irvine, catching back the story, I had a chance to run into Joe White, where I took my first course in African psychology. And that really, just opened my eyes, but also changed my trajectory. And that's when I decided that I wanted to be a psychologist, very much emulate, I think, the things that Joe White was doing and saying and teaching and practicing. But Joe's mission, of course, in cultivating talent was always clear with us that if a teacher's any good at what he or she does, that students should always exceed their own goal attainment. So he said, I'm sending you to grad school not to be like me, but to be better than me. Your job is to take and go to a whole different level. And so that's kind of where my career trajectory started. So I did well in his class. He made me his teaching assistant even as an undergraduate.
Wow.
With the goal of helping students master the class in the way in which he suggested that I did. So was excited about that. He said, when I send you to grad school, I'm not sending you there just to be clinically good. I want you to be clinically good, research good, academically good. And then the consultations and other stuff will come around. He said, the key to mental health, particularly for a young Black man or any person of color, is to always have a broad range of choices and options. Mm-hmm. So I went to graduate school trying to generate the best range of choices and options. He said, because you never know where the career opportunities are going to be. And he then gave me this one particular lesson. He said, produce excellence, and excellence will bring you opportunity. And in the midst of that producing excellence, it's brought me lots of opportunity that I'm very grateful for. So that's a long way around how I ultimately became a psychologist and love being a psychologist. I was born to be a psychologist. So but not even just a psychologist. I mean, I really embrace the title that my colleagues in the Association of Black Psychologists have given me, which is a healer. I want to be a healing presence in the lives of other people. And that's really what has happened now, even as I'm now doing something I never planned on doing in my life, which is being a university president.
But it's like Dr. White said, right? That you diversify and then it leads you to so many different areas.
That's it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. And, I'm in my final year of my Ph.D. program, and the words of wisdom that you shared with me today, and even our listeners who are in different stages in their journey, like, we all can take so much from it. So thank you.
Good. Good.
So how does your expertise in psychology, particularly in the realm of racial identity development, inform educational practices and policies to foster inclusivity and equity in higher education?
So for me, I think my research endeavors, in identity development have helped me to understand the fundamental difference between group comparisons and differences, which is what, lots of folk are trained in. Mm-hmm. So you can know the difference between, white, Black, Latino, Asian, Indian, et cetera. But it allowed me to get, in touch with the more within group variability that exists even among those demographic groups. So that has allowed me to have a greater appreciation for the within group variability that exists among brothers and sisters in the Asian community, in the Latino community, in even the indigenous Indian community, as well as among the Black community. And ironically, there are cultural differences around geography, around gender, around sexual orientation, around lots of things, even within the white community. So it's allowed me to have a greater appreciation really for humanity. But also, answer to your question, the appreciation that I've gained in understanding other people and the within group variability has allowed me to be able to develop a level of engagement with folk, because you find out where are the elements of common ground that you share. What are the things that you align with, as well as what are the things that you diverge from? And so that is what ultimately contributes, I think, to the ability to develop coalitions across demographic boundaries, and the solidarity, I think, that you end up developing with folk who on the surface are culturally different, mm-hmm. but at the deep structure level are, much more alike than you would otherwise believe.
And I also, want to echo what Pooja was saying earlier regarding, thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. I was truly advocating for you to, be a guest in our podcast. When I first saw you at the APA conference this past August, and I briefly talked to you after, mm-hmm. There was one quote that, truly resonated with me. And I wanted you to expand on this, because that really, that quote it was just powerful. This quote you said, I know you have so many words of wisdom, so you said you should never seek validation from your oppressor. Mm. And I've been thinking, as a professor and in this in the, in this white space field that is academia. How do you navigate that? How do you, be able to kind of not compromise your values, your ideals, but at the same time survive that space?
So we're trying to get deep into some teaching.
Oh, yes.
So let's see if we can do that.
We always want to go deeper, Doctor.
All right. So the symposium, I think, that you speak of at APA for our listeners and viewers was a piece about Joe White, really celebrating the legacy of Dr. Joe White.
Yes.
And one of the questions was, can you share with us any of the fundamental lessons that he taught you? And so one of the first lessons Dr. White taught me was not just as a Black man, but as a student. He said, you should never seek validation from your oppressor. Now, just park that again, as profound as that is, because each of us grows up in the human condition, looking to receive external validation from the broader world, which if you, anchor yourself in kind of, client-centered therapy and, Rogerian theory, who argues that our ability to feel good about ourselves is contingent upon the external valuation and validation that we receive from significant others in our life. So from the time that you arrive on the planet, you're always oriented to an external source of validation. The dynamics get particularly tricky when you think about racial dynamics because of the way in which racism and white supremacy have been so much of a dogged adversary in trying to affirm themselves by denigrating other people. And so, white is great because Black is not, or your hair is prettier, your skin tone is better, or something because someone else isn't. And fundamentally, what people never learn is you can't affirm yourself by denigrating other people. But what he was really arguing for me and others is that the problem is not, right, that, folk have an opinion. You should not be seeking validation from people who want to oppress you in the first place. So I've reasoned, I think, in my own maturity, that everybody's entitled to an opinion. The problem is not that either brothers and sisters in the white community or other folk, or even these redneck, wearing supremacists and racists have a negative opinion of you. The problem is you give a darn about what they think in the first place. And so, that becomes certainly an important lesson that served me well, not only in grad school, even as a young assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania, even as I came back and was recruited back to the University of California, Irvine all those years, and in navigating psychology spaces and academic spaces and higher ed generally spaces and even community spaces, not seeking validation from people who don't have my best interest in the first place has always been, I think, not only just a source of strength, but the ultimate sense of affirmation.
Yeah.
And you also mentioned in that same panel that when trust is built, success is revealed. How have you built trust within the Black community and with other communities of color?
So the trust for me, I think, has really two variables. One, and these will appear to be kind of opposite ends of a two-sided coin, but they're really, more integrated than I'm probably going to articulate in this answer. But building trust in some respects is about, the depth of your love and the quality of your service and the degree to which you are prepared to advocate across demographic boundaries for folk who are fundamentally or culturally different than you. And so as we come together to all celebrate our humanity and move in those spaces, then, that part becomes easy. So people, I've always invited people, put 5% emphasis on what folks say. and put 95% emphasis on what people do.
Mm.
So if you want to know how you engender trust, don't listen to what somebody says. Look at what somebody does. And so that'll be, that space. And so beyond the depth of your love and the quality of your service, it also raises a question, particularly for your generation coming through now, is what are you prepared to sacrifice? Because being an ally, being someone who is in the space, is never a question of do we really understand what the right thing to do is. I mean, sometimes we can be that oblivious, but most time not. Your own internal instincts, your just sense of humanity will allow you to really understand and appreciate what's at stake. The question is not, do you understand that? The question is, what are you prepared to sacrifice? Because there's a cost to being an ally. There's a cost to being, a person who is on the front line wanting to speak clearly and boldly about those things that ought to matter. So I've tried throughout my career to speak with a voice of uncompromising clarity. So most folk know I don't have much fear. I mean, the only person I fear is God. Short of that, everybody else is a human being.
Yeah.
So, and with that socialization and the teaching of the Joe Whites of the world and others, and my own maturity, it's allowed folk really to go into that. So that's really one half of the coin. So let me shorten the answer up and get to the other half. Because when you talk about trust, Donna, it's part of my clinical work. What I always remind patients and people generally is that we spend too much time externalizing trust. So that we make other people, whether they're ethnic groups, building coalitions, etc., have to jump through hoops. We do it in our personal relationships with people. We do it, with friends and colleagues. We do it with other folk. So that how many hoops is enough? Is it 5? Is it 10? Is it 20 before we're able to learn? My fundamental belief, this is kind of one of my Parhamisms, if you will, is that real trust is not an external circumstance. It is an internal virtue. Let me say that again. Real trust is not an external circumstance. It's an internal virtue, which means the issue is not, can you trust me or not? Like, how many hoops do I have to jump through? The real question is, can you trust yourself enough to take a risk with me? And so part of what I've had to do in my life is to learn to trust myself to take a risk with other folk. And that is another way to be able to build, that coalition and solidarity so that you don't make people have to jump through hoops. I mean, look at what's going on in the world now. Everybody looking for somebody to trust. I can't trust you because of blah, 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 blah. It's like we externalize, responsibility. What I want to do is internalize it and focus on those things that I can control. I can't control what other folk do. The only thing I can control is myself. And I'd invite our viewers and listeners to remember that real trust is not an external circumstance. It is an internal virtue. The question is not, can we trust other people, but rather, can we trust ourselves enough to take a risk with them? And that's one of the keys, I think, to building solidarity and strength.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh. Yes. Yes.
I really, whatever you're saying really resonates with me, not just from this perspective, because it also really, I'm a very spiritual person, and whatever you're talking about also is in the teachings of yoga. And I really appreciate how you're telling us that even with Dr. Donna's earlier comment to you about looking for validation, right? Like, be it in clinical practice or be it just as the human race, we're always looking for that external validation. But even with trust, everything kind of starts within you and can be changed within you. So thank you so much for sharing that perspective. And I didn't mean to cut you, Dr. Donna. I know you're going to ask something.
Nope, you're fine. You're perfectly okay. No, I was just saying too how now I have more quotable quotes from Dr. Parham. But as emerging leaders in the field, Pooja and I have been in, we've done a lot of leadership work together in various spaces. And we were also wondering, what advice would you give to young leaders in our field?
So that's an interesting question. For me, I think being able to define leadership is critical. First of all, know that we can lead people in positive and negative ways. So if you think about the fundamentals of leadership, are the ability to persuade folk to move in a particular direction. That sometimes can be very negative, sometimes it can be very positive. Look at what's going on in the election right now with the former president and that kind of piece. That is not just an example of what primary narcissism looks like in the context of that, but about critical and negative leadership and questionable needs to follow. But for me, leadership is less about a title. It is more about the principles that you have. It is more about the postures you assume. It is more about the behaviors that you display. And it is more about the service that you render. And so there are a lot of folk who get into positions because they're more enamored with the title. They're more enamored with the, elements that come along with that, as opposed to, the opportunity to serve and the opportunity to, be engaged with folk in that particular space. So one piece of advice I would give you is be able to clarify for yourselves, what is really my mission in being in this leadership capacity? And what do I, bring to the table that would allow me to be of service to either the organization or entity or, people that I'm trying to serve? The second piece is that fundamentally, I believe that ideas are the substance of behavior. Ideas are the substance of behavior. So if you want to know why people behave and respond the way they do, just get up into their head and examine what they think. So in the same way that you would in kind of a rational motive therapy mode, where the way you think influences how you feel and ultimately how you respond, if ideas are the substance of behavior, then what you want to do is develop for yourselves as leaders what I call a conceptual template. So imagine you have a little bubble popping out of your head with this big conceptual template here that ought to articulate the principles and the values and the assumptions you make about life. And it's that template that ought to guide the way you react and respond to the world. Because there are a lot of people in leadership positions who end up being very reactionary leaders. And they react to circumstance in a way that, rather than stepping back, taking a minute, and just think, what are the principles that I believe in? What are the values that I align myself with? And in saying that, what can I bring to this situation that would allow me to be clear about how I ought to respond to this, if I do respond at all? And that's why having that conceptual template is so important, because that's where your principles are, that's where your values are, right? And those are the elements, right? The assumptions you make about life that really ought to guide the behavior that you engage in as leaders.
Thank you. Thank you for that.
I'm really happy you said that, because we see that a lot, and what you've shared is something Dr. Donna and I talk a lot about, like offline, that people like higher up in like leadership positions sometimes react from, we at the end of the day, we also don't know their experiences totally, right? And where that's coming from. Something might have been triggered, etc. But I guess my question, the follow-up question to that is, how do we kind of deal with that? Let's say some of us have like a lower position on the board, and we try to, especially as young leaders, elders think when we do it also in a very respectful way, or we kind of share like a difference in opinion, it's seen as they're not respecting us. She has an attitude problem, XYZ, right? So I guess my question to you is, if we have like a different position from them, how do we kind of navigate that and not kind of let it affect the work that we want to do, and just kind of be stuck in that space? Because that's what we've been seeing in some spaces we've been in over the years.
So the value of being young is that you have kind of restless energy. And like all of us, that restless energy wants and demands change now. Right?
Yeah.
And it's akin, I think, to what happens, I think, even being a senior leader and a senior executive, and whether I'm now the president at California State University, Dominguez Hills, or when I was the vice chancellor at Irvine, or when I chaired and was president of the National Association of Black Psychologists, any leadership position, when I was president of the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development in ACA, you'll find this, I think, there, that you can always afford to get things done as long as you don't want to get them done in about the first 3 to 6 months. And the reason is because you just don't know enough yet. So it isn't a function of me deciding that this is a scandalous way to be going, or something more mild like, God, I have a fundamental disagreement with this. Like, that ain't quite sitting right with me. But what I had to understand, and I learned this lesson, by the way, being a young assistant professor at the University of Pennsylvania. And I'd come into faculty meetings and I'm like, excuse me, and begin to provide observation and critique on particular things. And what I didn't understand is I knew how they work. What I didn't know is why they work.
Yeah.
And what I didn't understand is the personal investment that colleagues had in having things the way they were. So that in my observation and even critique, the way some people took it was not as a critique on the substance of the idea, but rather as a critique on them, since they had so much investment in the way in which things were.
Yeah.
So oftentimes what happens is, if you don't, play it right, if you don't learn, if you don't study, if you don't know why stuff is, people oftentimes take critique as a personal attack, even though it's unbeknownst to you. And that's what I mean by you sometimes just don't know enough about why that is. That's what the learning that comes through being in those positions where you're able to be influential young leaders, in this case, in the context of those board positions, because you don't know whether or not people are taking it personal because of that. But what I'd also say is, so patience is important. I think being able to teach and study is important, but also the way in which you provide the feedback. So as opposed to, you ought to change this, right? A new approach might be something like, help me understand why this and this. Or what I would do sometimes as I got more mature, I'd say, fundamentally, we're talking about this. And I see us doing this. And maybe it's me, but perhaps I'm seeing, so you're trying to take a little responsibility yourself. Perhaps I'm seeing some incongruence between what we preach and what we practice. Right?
Yeah.
I'm at Penn. And we have a program that I'm the only African American academic psychologist at Penn at that point. Later understood that I was the first they ever hired in their 200-some-year history after they were founded by Ben Franklin.
Wow.
Didn't know it before I got there, found out after I got there. But not the point. The point being is I'm in faculty meetings creating these pieces. I'm like, we have a whole curriculum where we're training master's and doctoral students to go out and render psychological services to a city like Philadelphia that at that point was 44% Black. But we have no courses in multicultural counseling or African American psychology. Somewhere I read in APA that one should be careful about practicing outside of their scope of competence. But how do we expect our students to be culturally competent if A, I'm the only Black person in the house, and B, none of the curriculum or practicum experiences are designed to be able to do that? What we're doing is using the same kind of theories and techniques to do that. And quoting Wade Nobles, I'm like, you can't put, shoe polish on Freud and assume that somehow that's going to be African-centered therapy.
Right.
So, some of the tension got real rough until I understood that people were personally invested in the way things were. But, right, the short answer to your question is, I think understanding why things are the way they are, not just what's going on, but why, right? How invested are people doing that? But also the technique that you use in terms of your own narrative and conversation. Words matter. And so if you come at it as a teaching moment, as a naive person who, like, help me understand why this does this, or I thought I read this, but now I'm seeing this, like, help me reconcile the difference there, is a way of having them kind of teach, but also have the light bulb go off in their own heads. Now, ultimately, you now cannot graduate, and this happened years ago after I left, or actually it happened while I was there, but you can't graduate from the University of Pennsylvania doctoral program without a mandatory course in Black psychology. But it wasn't because it happened the first year that I was there. It just took a minute to be able to get there when people said, oh, yeah, yeah, you're right.
Yeah. I definitely need to hear this again and again. And like when I do, I'm going to come back to this episode.
In fact, remember this too. Y'all ever heard of President Jimmy Carter?
Yes.
Okay. So Jimmy Carter, in one of his books, really complimented young people. He said, the changes that we have made in the nation have come about because of the restlessness of young people and their desire to see change and advocacy. So he was really complimenting, right, younger generations of folk in terms of the advocacy. And it doesn't matter whether it was civil rights and King and Malcolm or Black Power or whatever, they're all young people that are coming through. The peace movement, anti-war, all those coming with young people, moving into space, pushing up against the establishment. So in that respect, I think you don't want to apologize for the restlessness. You want to be able to learn how to harness it.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of what I remind folks, so another one of my Parhamisms here, is that life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites and fruitful harmony. Let me say that again. Life at its best is a creative synthesis of opposites and fruitful harmony. It has a lot of different meanings. But one of them is sometimes your greatest strength can be your greatest weakness. Sometimes your greatest weakness can be your greatest strength. It just depends on the context. So your greatest strength is, right, your youth and your advocacy and your restlessness for change. But change the context, your worst nightmare, right, can be your restlessness and your other stuff, and I want stuff done now, and blah, blah, blah. And that's where the frustration sometimes comes in of being able to do that.
I'm so happy you're saying all of this to me. I mean, not to me, but to our listeners today. I'm obviously taking it to
it's
myself.
It's okay to personalize it. It's all good.
If we had this conversation 3 years ago, I don't think my consciousness would have been able to like grasp it the way it is today. Because also with that maturity, I've also had to learn how to, like you said, harness that restlessness, and I still have a long way to go. So I'm very, very, very grateful for what all you just shared. Thank you.
No, my pleasure. All right, keep on going.
Okay.
What else y'all want to know?
So as we kind of reach towards the end of like our podcast, what we really focus on is the cross-racial ethnic solidarity work that professionals do in their spaces. Mm-hmm. So we'd like to know, what work have you done with cross-racial ethnic solidarity as a mentor, scholar, professor, and administrator?
Kind of like, what work haven't I done?
Yeah.
Fundamentally, I think it starts out with training new generations of scholars and social advocates. So if you look at the students that I've influenced and trained over the years, that is kind of a multicultural mecca of folk that I've been blessed to mentor and train. It continues with the associations that I've engaged with. So even with my work within APA, at Division 45. All that's been across demographic boundaries. If you look at my work and the people that I've written with or presented with in conferences, some of my colleagues that are literally like family, brothers and sisters to me, are in that space. Years ago, through mostly the American Counseling Association, several of us formed a group called the NIMC, National Institute for Multicultural Competence. It was a group generated by Michael D'Andrea, Dr. D'Andrea, who was at the University of Hawaii, he and Judy Daniels. But it had people like Daryl Sue and Alan Ivey and Mary Bradford Ivey and Patricia Arredondo and Don Locke and Beverly O'Brien and myself. So that as you saw us making that kind of multicultural movement, we weren't just talking about it or writing about it or presenting about it. We were actually advocating for it within that. So if you look at some of the changes that occurred within the American Counseling Association space back then, it was as a result of that NIMC, National Institute for Multicultural Competence. Well, most of us have joint memberships in different places. And so Michael was a counselor educator, so he's more connected to ACA. Daryl and I, Patricia, are members of both ACA, but also APA. So that same kind of energy and collaboration and excitement we were able to bring into these particular spaces. And then when you combine with other people that we've been able to work with across demographic boundaries, I've just been blessed by what Division 45 has done, how it's created really for people of color, really kind of a home, really.
Yeah.
It's kind of a cultural comfort zone in the midst of what has been a sea of cultural sterility. And I contrast this because people say, well, how come you never ran for office within APA? And it was a very deliberate reason for that, with no interest at all in intent. Even though I've been blessed by APA to be their minority fellowship program, made me minority fellow when I was going through graduate school. So that whole minority fellowship program was a good resource, as was Division 45. And even the most kind of culturally sensitive division for a while certainly was not clinical, it was counseling psych, because we were all in counseling psych. And so we were able to make some of the changes in terms of leadership, in terms of scholarship, in terms of principles and actions, social justice, all that. If you look at the places like the Winter Roundtable, where you have Robert Carter and Janet Helms, and really going back to Sam Johnson, way back in the day, who really first founded the Roundtable, and all the people since who have stood it up. All of that, I think, is part and parcel of the broader coalition of culturally diverse people that have been able to pull it together. So those are examples of the ways in which that's been operationalized over time, but also the blessing, I think, of being able to connect in those ways with colleagues who, again, may be demographically different, but absolutely the same in terms of their desire for change, for social justice, and for each of us to affirm the dignity and humanity of everybody's person is fundamentally what really family is about.
Yes.
Yeah. Our last question for you is, how do we continue to engage in cross-racial ethnic solidarity within our communities that can minimize harm that various groups experience, but not ignore the harm that our own group has caused others?
So continuing solidarity and minimizing harm, I think, are related, but in some cases a little different, because one variable you have more control over, I think, than the other. Continued solidarity is easier because it requires, if not demands, that we work across demographic boundary and coalitions to be able to get anything done. You know, Brother Jesse was clear about, you know, the patchwork quilt, and that nobody's patch is big enough to be able to get things done. But if you can pull together everybody's patch and put them into this magnificent quilt, then that becomes the bonding, if you will, that allows us to provide a blanket of cover over everybody to be able to create, you know, kind of the social justice momentum I think that we want to do. So fundamentally, it starts out with respect for the dignity and humanity of everybody. Fundamentally, it starts out with the willingness to build those coalitions across demographic boundaries. Fundamentally, it starts out with the willingness to listen and learn so that you find out what is other people's issues that they are navigating, and how does that align with or diverge from those things that you have to move through. But also, I've always defined myself as a servant leader. So I'm less impressed with the title. And it's nice that I'm a president, but if I can't serve my community or use that platform to transform lives on my campus or to impact the broader community of, you know, higher education in my space, it wasn't no sense of me being there. So really it's about the quality of your love and the depth of your service and the ability for people to cross those demographic boundaries, you know, to see where that's at. So that to me, in terms of building solidarity and coalition, is what's important. How do you contribute to risk reduction is more difficult because there's so many of those things that we don't control. And what's true is, I think what the elders and ancestors now, Frances Cress Welsing, reminded us when she was quoting Neely Fuller, who said, if you don't understand racism and white supremacy, what it is and how it functions, then everything else you think you understand will only confuse you. And so in navigating that space, what you want to do is be able to watch, learn, listen, and see how the dynamics of that racism and white supremacy impact organizations and systems and even individuals, and how behaviors and organizational dynamics and practices and policies are really controlled and impacted by some of that. So being able to point some of that out allows us to mitigate, I think, some of the crazy that happens. I think education is also a key. The level of cultural ignorance that is, you know, existing in the country right now is so pervasive. And the only way to really get past that is to provide people with a different level of education than they're currently receiving. And so we will not embrace, you know, Florida governors who talk about where woke goes to die, or Texas governors who argue that we're going to dismantle diversity initiatives, or, you know, we won't be moved by, you know, school boards and public policies and other things that, you know, are so afraid of disrupting the fragile sensibilities that exist in young white children because we don't want them to feel disrupted. Well, yeah, you do, because, you know, Freud had a great theory of inertia. His law of inertia argued that the human condition would only exert the amount of energy necessary to meet its need in a given moment. Layfolk have a much greater expression, which is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. If you can't convince people that what you're doing is not okay, they have no motivation to change what it is they do. So we have to find ways to disrupt people's fragile sensibilities about the way things are in favor of the way things might be. That's where hope comes from. You know, when you talk about Obama's audacity of hope, or Dr. King, who's one of my heroes, and what he really believed, that's a piece that's important. But I also am argued, or influenced, I should say, by the voice of Brother King. And Dr. King argued, he said, our lives begin to end the day we become silent about the things that matter. So I'm one of those folk who refuses to be silent about the things that matter. And one of the things we want to do in trying to help create this safe environment, if you will, is to not be silent about the things that matter. I mean, let's be clear. In our hearts, it's 10% of the folk on this side who are just the out and out, crazy, racist, redneck, white supremacist kind of folk. And it's the 10% on this side who are the core, liberal-minded kind of folk. The fight is not for these folk. These folk aren't moving. Yep. The fight really is for that 60 to 80% of the folk in the middle. And particularly for brothers and sisters in the white community who are principally responsible for the racism that exists in the world. Yep. I don't want to denigrate somebody because they're white. I love people, whatever demographic they happen to be, and that's part of their humanity.
Yeah.
But what I want to do is invite our white colleagues to not sit in silence.
Yes.
Yeah.
Because it's sitting in silence that allows them to be able to do that. I mean, so my fundamental question, I've asked a lot of these in my career, but the fundamental question to brothers and sisters in the white community who are viewing this podcast is, how can you bear witness to the suffering of other people, sit in silence, and still maintain your humanity?
Not just what.
Yeah, and not just white folk. You're exactly right.
Yeah, yep.
It could be anybody who's a person. How do you bear witness to the suffering of other people? But that goes back to what I was talking to you guys earlier about. In fact, Don, I was telling you about the question is, what are you prepared to sacrifice?
Yep.
Because I was speaking last week. I was in DC, and I was talking with the U.S. Japan Council at their conference there. And I was on a panel talking about Black Japanese relationships and how do we do something about this anti-Asian hate going on in the world, and which is too pronounced. And so I was arguing some of the same things about being able to do that. But the point being, while we can't control some of the crazy that exists in the world, what we can control is how we appreciate and participate in people's lives and build those coalitions across the demographic boundaries. Yeah. And if you look at most of the incidents, there were, since the Vincent Chin death in Detroit in 82, I want to say.
Yeah, it was in the
80s. The hands of two white men. You would think that America's consciousness has been pricked. But then you come and you see all the challenges that have come from, to brothers and sisters in the Asian community. And because the level of cultural ignorance is so pronounced, there are people who are engaging in really denigrating work, but it's not as traumatic as the Vincent Chin deaths where he lost his life, unfortunately. But it's really what Daryl Sue talks about and his students, and Chet Pierce before him, who really developed this theory of the microaggressions, where when you think about the microaggressions, the microassaults, the microinvalidations, in the last several years, there have been some calculated people who track Asian hate, several of which were on the panel, by the way. There are 11,400 incidents that have happened in the last couple of years, documented. But most of those are not, I came and stabbed somebody. Most of those are the microassaults, microaggressions, and microinvalidations. But some of that comes from ignorance. Some of that comes from bias that people are sometimes not aware of. Or sometimes people will do things or say things, right, by just not knowing and not even aware. It goes right over their head that, right, they are doing or saying what it is that is offensive to somebody else. See, I think we can cut down on some of that as well. Not just the, traumatic incidents, the Atlanta spa where we're shooting up folk and going after Asian women. The, incidents like that are harder to control. And that's where we have to build coalition that allows us to advocate for gun reform so that there are too many guns on the streets in America. And we just haven't lost enough people yet, unfortunately, for people to get smart and change the laws in a way that we don't need to talk about Second Amendment rights and, people bearing arms as somehow this is the Revolutionary War days. But those things will be harder to control. But what we can do is educate a broader, share of the population so that they're in concert with folk about ways in which we can enhance people's understanding, increase people's appreciation, and hopefully support people's respect for, right, folk who are culturally different. And that has to be one of the keys that we move forward, going forward in the world.
Thank you
Lastly,
so much.
I'll say, I know that was our last question, but I'll leave you with this. For my own career, I get up every day and think about the words of the great Algerian psychiatrist Frantz Fanon. Fanon argued, he said, each generation out of relative obscurity must reach out and seek to fulfill its legacy or betray it. I get up every day asking the question of, have I fulfilled or betrayed the legacy that I've been blessed to inherit? And even as you see that picture of Frederick Douglass behind me, right, that I look and always is just a, consummate warrior, right? That's that warrior healer, right, in me. I invite you and our listeners, both you, Pooja, and Donna, to think about, right, if your generation has an opportunity to fulfill its legacy or betray it, right? Are the actions that you engage in, are the manuscripts you write, is the service that you render fulfilling or betraying the legacy that your ancestors have been blessed to be able to provide, right? And I'm talking about ancestors, they're all members of the human family who've allowed us to arrive at this space and time, even to allow you to do this wonderful podcast that you're doing in support of President Coakley and what he's doing.
And my mentor.
And your mentor. So please give them my best. Tell them thank you again for the invitation. It's an honor to be with you both.
Oh my gosh. The honor is ours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And our mentor, Dr. Donna.
That's right.
Thank you so much. I really hope I get to cross paths with you in person because, I would love to talk so much more with you.
I will look forward to that. Thank you for having me.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to our podcast today. We hope you enjoyed the episode. For more information about today's guests and their social media links, you can click on the description links of the episode. Pooja Mami Dana and Dr. Donna Demanarig host this podcast. Our podcast team includes our podcast interns, Alexis Rios from the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas, and Petra Zadroga from Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts. We also want to acknowledge our production team, David DeVito and Rachel Sheffer.
If you would like to know more about us or to watch video clips of this interview, then follow us on Instagram at APADiv45_Presidential Task Force, on TikTok and X at APADiv45_Coakley, or on YouTube and Facebook at Dr. Kevin Coakley's APA Division 45 Presidential Task Force.
Strength and solidarity. The strength and solidarity.